Hello, this is Mark from Atlas Violins. Welcome to my workbench. Today I'm going to be teaching you how to properly fit and install a set of pegs to a violin. The instrument that we are using today is a factory-made violin that has a set of pegs that's been roughly fit to the instrument, but finer fitting is needed in order for them to fit to work and operate properly for the violin player. Let's begin. Let's take a look at some of the tools we'll be using today. First is what's called a peg shaper block. This happens to be a Reaming brand one, and I find it's probably one of the more common models out there. There's other manufacturers, most notably Alberti, that produces a really high quality peg shaper, but this works just as well as long as you make sure the blades are sharp and they've been adjusted properly to meet the taper of your violin size peg reamer. The peg reamer needs to be good and sharp, and it also needs to be of the correct size for violin, which means that the taper ratio is 1:20. We will also need a high quality metal rule with millimeter indications on there, a rat tail file, a standard flat file, and what I like to call a suppressor. This is used when using the peg block to firmly seat the peg into the hole when it's being fitted and turned, so that it seats properly and you get a very accurate reshaping of the peg shaft. Before I begin any fitting of the pegs, I want to measure what the current distance is between the exterior wall of the peg box and that to the collar of the thumb piece. On a properly fitted violin peg, that should be 12 millimeters. This happens to be about 14.5 millimeters. So that lets me know that I have about 2.5 millimeters of shortening to do to properly fit this peg. I'm also going to measure and see what the others are so I can better know how much reshaping I need to do. And yes, this one's almost close to 17 millimeters. This is about 14.5, and this one is at 14. I also like to check at this moment just how well they fit currently, and I find the best way to do that is to fully remove the peg and lightly insert it back into the peg hole of the peg box. And then I'm going to turn with just very light pressure, 360 degrees, and I'm looking for any consistency and feel of how that's turning. It should feel very consistent. If I get to an area where it feels like the peg lurches forward, I know that something is out of round with the peg shaft itself and that it definitely needs to be refit. This peg here feels pretty good, even though I feel a slight one right there. Let's see what this is like. And this one also has a slight lurch, and I also know that as I turn it, the peg seems to want to kind of push itself out a little bit and then come back in at certain points when it's being revolved. So I definitely know these pegs need to be fit better in order for them to work properly. So the first step is going to be to reshape the peg shaft and to true it up so that it's perfectly round and at the correct taper. And I'm going to use this peg shaper block to accomplish that. This block has 4 different size holes in it, and so I need to find the appropriate size for this peg. So let's see which one that is. This is way too big. You can see a lot of wiggle room. Still too big. That is really close, but I'm right at the collar. And this is the appropriate size to begin refitting our peg shaft. So you can see I have almost a centimeter of space on the outside, and that's about right, and I'll show you how to true up that area of the shaft later. But this is the size we're going to use in order to reshape our peg shaft. So that suppressor I was talking to you about, you can see there's a little space in here where the peg shaft is exposed. And I have this in here with just a very light amount of pressure in this direction. I don't want to really cram this in here very tight. And I'm just going to start turning it, a little downward pressure from my suppressor. And I can see I'm just starting to make some wood shavings. And this works just like an old-fashioned pencil sharpener. So you turn it, and every time I turn, I'm applying a little bit more pressure inward. And I'm looking for that point where I see light shavings pretty much extend the entire length of the peg shaft. That lets me know I'm cutting the entire peg shaft. I'm not missing any areas, and the end result should be a perfectly fit peg. I am just about there. So very light pressure now. I'm just going to keep turning it in place until it stops cutting, and then I'll back the peg out. So there we go, there's our first peg, and you can see I have an area up by the collar that I still need to adjust, but I'll show you how to do that in a little bit later. So let's put this back in and see how it fits. Very good, much better. Let's take a measurement here. So now I'm at about 13.5 millimeters. As I said before, I want this to be finished at 12 millimeters. So I have a little bit of room here to reshape the peg hole that this peg fits into. And once I do that, this is going to be a perfectly fitted peg. So now that I have the rest of my peg shafts fitted, I need to finish the final area of the shaft that's up close to the collar of the thumb piece. In order to do this, it's a two-step process. So I'm going to remove a peg, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab one of my violin knives, and I am just going to score the area just below the collar. So I'm going to go all the way around, and this is going to prevent any tear out of the collar itself. The collar is a very fragile part of the peg, and it's very easy to break off a piece, and then you have kind of an ugly looking peg afterwards, and we want our pegs to look beautiful and new, so damaging that collar would not be in our best interest. So I've scored around the collar just to ensure that when I'm removing the wood from this upper part of the shaft, the fibers aren't going to kind of tear out into any of the wood that makes up that portion of the collar. So now I'll go back to my peg block, and as I was using this size here to do the initial fitting, I'm going to move up one size, and you can see now my peg fully fits, or the entire length of the peg fits inside this hole. And what's happening is it's not touching any of the area of the shaft that I've already finally fitting. It's just barely making contact to the portion of the shaft that I need to do the final shaping of. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this peg, and I'm going to lightly, as I'm turning, pull up. It takes a little bit of skill to get used to, because you're turning it one way and you're trying to apply just a little bit of up pressure. And as I do that, you can see I'm cutting away from the portion of the shaft that hasn't been fitted yet. Blow away a little bit of the shaving so I can see better. And I want to keep doing this just until I meet that section of the fitted shaft, and I've removed any kind of step from the unfitted portion, and the end result should look like one uniform shaft. You can see I have a little bit more to go, and again kind of pulling up into the blade, and it's just cutting that unfinished section of the shaft. A little bit more. So it takes a sharp eye to kind of make sure you're not going too far, because I definitely don't want to damage any of that area of the shaft that I've perfectly fit already. It'll screw up the rest of the peg itself if I do. So there we go. So that looks just about right. There's no step. It feels all nice and smooth. And there's one peg. So now that our peg shafts are complete, it's time to turn our attention to the holes in the peg box that actually accept the pegs. We want to true up these holes to make sure that the peg has a proper seat in the peg box and will provide a very secure bearing for tuning purposes. The tool that we're going to use for this is called the reamer. The reamer has two methods of operation. The most obvious way is when you place the reamer into the hole of the peg box and you turn the reamer clockwise, you'll notice that the blades of the reamer are aligned to engage the wood and cut away the wood as it's being turned. And anytime that the peg fits very far out from what its final position is going to be, you're very well just going to start out by placing the reamer into the peg hole and turning it clockwise and cutting away material, therefore enlarging the hole that the peg fits into. But when we're really close to the finished length already, as we are in this case, so this peg is at about 12.5 millimeters. I only have about a half millimeter of enlarging to do, or essentially of shortening to do, to get this peg to fit properly. And the less obvious method of use for a peg reamer is to do what's called back spinning the reamer. You place the reamer into the hole of the peg box, and you apply just kind of some light firm pressure, and you spin the reamer backwards, and instead of cutting the wood or material, what's actually happening is you're compressing the wood fibers of that hole in the peg box and essentially burnishing the wood. And this will create a better fit for the peg, because over time of use, like let's say if I just initially cut away my hole and set it to 12 millimeters, over maybe the first year of use and a player tuning these pegs, that wood in the peg box is going to compress, and what was once a 12 millimeter fit may over the first year shrink down to maybe 10 millimeters. So by compressing the wood fibers in the beginning, you'll notice that your pegs will stay fit better for longer. So now I'm ready to start using the reamer. So I'll begin with my E peg, and all the other pegs that I'm not worried about fitting, I'm going to turn them so the thumb piece is kind of up and vertical. It just keeps them out of the way of my reamer when I'm using. So I'll remove the peg, and because this was so close to the finished length already, I'm going to begin by back spinning, and that will be all the fitting that this hole needs. So I'm turning it backwards, and I'm applying very light pressure or force into the hole of the peg box. And I can hear some of the fibers scraping, and I'll apply a little bit more force to the reamer itself. And I'm also feeling, as I turn it, to make sure that it feels very consistent as I rotate the reamer in the hole of the peg box. So now I'm going to remove it, put the peg back in, and bingo, I'm right at 12 millimeters. So now this peg is done, I'll turn that out of the way, and I'll come up here to my A peg. I want to take a proper reading, and again, I'm so close to 12. So this one, I'm going to do just a little bit of back reaming. Very light force being applied as in terms of pushing it into the peg hole. And bingo, right at 12. I'll turn it around, and we'll do the final two pegs. We'll start with G. Again, take a measurement. And I'm pretty much right at 12, so again, just a little back spinning. Perfect. And then lastly to our D peg, so about 12.5. So because all these pegs, after I had finished the shafts, fit pretty close to their final length, you'll notice I'm not going to do any clockwise turning of this reamer or cutting motion. It's all backspin. And this is what really allows you to finely set the length of each peg. Still a little bit more to go. So I'll put the reamer back in, backspin, and I'll apply just a little bit more force in this direction. And again, feeling for a very consistent feel as I rotate the reamer. Right at 12. So now that the fit of our pegs is complete, it's time to take care of the last couple details. The first is going to be to trim up the ends of the pegs and bring them flush to the exterior wall of the peg box. As you can see, the end of the peg should be slightly domed. And so when I'm trimming the ends of the pegs, I want that high part of that dome to be roughly flush with the exterior wall. So it may look a little bit counterset when you look at where the edge of the peg is, but right at the top it should be flush with the exterior wall of the peg box. So I'll begin by marking those with a 0.5 millimeter mechanical pencil, a really fine pencil, and I'll mark the shafts that stick out past the peg wall like this one. And if it's just the high part of the dome, make a little squiggle there so I know to shape that down. Same with this peg, and this one needs a little bit of trimming, so I'll mark the shaft where it's sticking out a little bit proud. All right, so now I'll take this over to my probably my disc sander. If it was a lot more material than this, I would use a saw to cut it first. But I'm going to take it over to my disc sander and just buzz the ends flush with the exterior wall of the peg box. Now that we've trimmed the ends of our pegs down to their final length, it's time to reshape the ends from this harsh, sharp, flat to a nice domed, rounded surface. We'll begin by using the file and holding the file at a 20 to 30 degree angle. I'm going to file a beveled surface around the entire perimeter of the peg end. I'll turn it in my left hand, file with my right, trying to keep the angle of my file the same so I get a nice consistent bevel. Like so. So once I get to this point, I'm going to file upward towards the center and create and kind of remove that hard bevel area and soften all those edges until we get a domed surface, like so. And we'll finish that with some sandpaper. Start with a coarse grit. I press into the palm of my hand, which naturally creates a cupped surface, which helps reinforce that domed look that we're looking for. Switch to the next grade of sandpaper. Turning the peg into the palm of my hand. And my final grit here, which is a 320. There we go, a nice rounded domed surface. If I wanted to create a little bit more sheen, I could do that with some steel wool. Now I'm going to use my scratch awl and I'm going to mark a spot on each peg where I want my string hole to go. I like to make my mark roughly 1/3 of the width of the opening over from the thumb piece side of the peg. Using a 1/16 size drill bit, I've drilled a hole in each peg where I want my string hole to go. I'm next going to use a rat tail file and file a bevel over this hole. And this will ensure that the string, when it's getting wound along the peg, won't develop a harsh kink at that point. And it gives a little bit better of a starting surface when you're trying to thread the string through the peg. Finally, we're ready to dope our pegs. I like to use a combination of two things. One is soap and the other is Hill brand peg compound. I find with freshly fitted pegs, it's very helpful to use a little bit of soap first before applying the Hill compound. It creates a better bearing and surface for the Hill compound to adhere to and really ensures a smooth yet very stable hold in your peg tuning. So let's try some. So I've applied it to the areas that it makes contact with the holes in the peg box. And I'm going to turn it in a couple times. And you can see nice, even, consistent wear marks developing that look like rings around the pegs. If this was a poorly fit peg, that would look very inconsistent, but obviously we did a very good job. And so now we'll apply the Hill brand peg compound. And I just want to apply it to the areas that actually make contact with the peg box. And likewise, we're going to turn this peg a couple rotations. And there we go. Perfectly fit pegs. Have a perfect bearing for tuning. These pegs will tune smoothly, and they'll hold consistently and really be an ease for the player to use. If you like this video, make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel and hit the bell so you'll be notified whenever I make new videos in the future. Thank you. Thanks for watching.